Have you ever witnessed a moment where a child's quiet strength could shatter every lie around her? This is the story of a little girl, humiliated at her stepmother's wedding, and the police officer, and his loyal German shepherd, who refused to let her suffer alone. What followed was a battle for truth, a fight for justice, and the rebirth of a family when all hope seemed lost. Before we begin, tell me, where are you watching from today? I'd love to see your city or town in the comments. And if you believe every child deserves protection, don't forget to subscribe so you won't miss the stories we share here. May this day bring you peace, hope, and a reminder that miracles can still happen. The snow had not stopped falling all morning, laying a heavy white blanket over the small Vermont town. The streets were narrow and winding, lined with houses dressed in frost, their windows glowing faintly against the gray sky. By late afternoon, the air had grown sharper, the kind that pricked the skin like needles. From a distance, the old town hall stood like a beacon of warmth, its windows ablaze with golden light, laughter and music spilling into the frozen air. Inside, the wedding of the season was underway, a celebration of elegance and excess, where every guest wore fur-lined coats and shimmering gowns, their laughter rising above the tinkling of glasses and the steady hum of music. Yet, among the whirl of joy and congratulatory embraces, there was one figure who did not belong. Her name was Lila Harper, just 7 years old, the daughter of a once prosperous businessman who had died suddenly half a year earlier. She had his eyes, dark and thoughtful, always seeming older than her years, and his delicate features. But today those eyes were wide and trembling, her hair tangled around her thin face. She wore a faded dress, its hem frayed, far too small for a celebration like this. In her tiny hands she clutched a battered frame with a photograph of her father inside, the last anchor to a life that had crumbled. By her side was a small battered suitcase, filled with whatever clothes she had been allowed to keep. Lila stood alone near a pillar at the far end of the hall, trying to shrink into invisibility while the wedding crowd danced and laughed, as if she were not there. At the center of it all stood Vivian Harrington, Lila's new stepmother, the bride of the night. She was 30 years old, a tall woman with sharp cheekbones and a smile that could convince any stranger of her kindness. Her long auburn hair was styled perfectly in glossy waves that caught the chandelier's light. To the public eye, Vivian was the picture of virtue, the woman who had stayed behind after her wealthy husband's death to raise his young daughter. She was admired for her resilience, praised for her apparent devotion. Yet those who lived under her roof knew another side: cold calculation, a hunger for status, and disdain for anything that threatened her image. For her, Lila was nothing but a shadow of the man she had married, a burden she was forced to tolerate. Moving among the crowd was Martha Caldwell, Vivian's aunt. Martha was a heavy-set woman in her 50s, short but broad, with arms that always folded across her chest as if daring someone to defy her. Her voice carried sharpness, and her favorite pastime was humiliating those weaker than herself. Beside her shuffled her husband, Harold Caldwell, a gray-haired man with a paunch straining against his suit jacket. He was known for his mocking chuckles and cruel smirks, never raising his voice but always cutting people down with disdain. Together, they were Vivian's greatest supporters, willing to do anything to preserve the facade of the family. The guests, men in tailored suits and women in gowns of silk and lace, glanced at Lila every so often with whispers they didn't bother to hide. "Is that the girl?" one man muttered, his eyes cold. "She looks like a beggar," another replied with indifference. To them, she was not a child in mourning, but a reminder of lost wealth. Near the back wall, a man in uniform had been standing quietly, detached from the celebration. Mark Dalton, age 42, was a police officer in the local precinct. Tall and broad-shouldered, his dark brown hair was streaked with gray at the temples, his jaw set firm, and his storm-gray eyes carried the weight of someone who had seen too much loss. Years ago, Mark had once been the proud father of a daughter, Sarah, a bright girl with golden hair, who had died in a car accident when she was only 8. That tragedy had carved grief into his bones, making him more reserved, more cautious with his emotions. Yet it also forged a quiet strength. He had never remarried, choosing instead to live in a modest wooden house on the outskirts of town, with only his partner, a loyal German shepherd named Ranger. Ranger was 7 years old, a strong black and silver German shepherd with a muscular build and intelligent amber eyes. Trained as a police K9, he was disciplined yet affectionate, fiercely protective of those he trusted. Tonight, Mark had been asked to provide discreet security at the wedding because of the wealthy guests in attendance. Ranger lay at his feet, ears pricked, eyes scanning the crowd with quiet vigilance. Yet even the dog seemed uneasy, his gaze often flicking toward the small girl pressed against the pillar, as though sensing the storm of cruelty gathering around her. It was then that Martha noticed Lila, her lips curling. She marched toward the girl, her heels striking the marble floor. "Keep your head down," she snapped, her voice cutting across the music. "Don't bring shame to your aunt's wedding." Harold followed with a short grunt, his lips twisting into a sneer. "Your father is dead. You don't belong here anymore. Standing here just makes you a laughingstock." Lila lifted her eyes briefly, tears brimming, her voice choked with desperation. "Please, I only want to watch from a distance." But the crowd avoided her gaze, some turning their backs, others sipping wine to pretend they had not heard. Martha's irritation flared. In one swift movement, she grabbed a bucket of water from a passing waiter and dumped it over Lila's head. The icy shock made the child gasp, her whole frame shaking violently. The guests erupted, some laughing openly, others covering their mouths while failing to hide their smirks. Lila collapsed to her knees, drenched, clutching her father's photo to her chest as if it alone could shield her. Her sobs broke into gasps. "Please, don't throw me out. I'm begging you." But her words were swallowed by laughter and chatter, by the relentless hum of indifference. The bride herself stepped forward. Vivian, radiant in her gown, moved closer with her painted smile, a performance for the guests. To them, she was a saint, forced to endure the tantrums of her stepchild. Yet, as she leaned toward Lila, her voice dropped low, sharp as glass. "Get out of here before I ruin your life." Lila's tears spilled freely, her small shoulders trembling under the weight of rejection. Across the hall, Mark Dalton froze, his breath catching in his chest. He saw not just a shivering child, but an echo of Sarah, his little girl, crying in a hospital bed years ago. His grip tightened on the glass in his hand until it slipped and shattered against the floor. Ranger stood abruptly, ears forward, sensing his master's turmoil. Mark's heart pounded. He could not stand still any longer. He stepped forward, his boots striking the polished floor with deliberate weight. The sound cut through the laughter, drawing startled glances. His broad frame filled the space as he walked straight to the child, removing his heavy police coat and draping it around her small body. The oversized garment swallowed her drenched dress, bringing warmth against her shivering frame. Lila tilted her tearful face upward, her eyes wide, hardly believing what was happening. The music still played faintly, but no one was listening. Every eye in the room had turned to them. Ranger padded forward, placing himself between the girl and the hostile crowd, his fur bristling, his amber eyes fierce. The hall fell silent, as if holding its breath. Mark straightened slowly, his storm-gray eyes sweeping over the faces of the guests who had laughed moments before. His voice, calm yet edged with fury, rang out in the stunned silence. "Doesn't anyone see anything wrong here?" His question landed like a blow, and unease rippled across the hall. But no answer came, only silence and shifting eyes. And so, beneath the glittering lights of the wedding hall, as snow fell heavy outside, a police officer, his loyal German shepherd, and a trembling little girl stood together, an unlikely trinity of sorrow, protection, and defiance. The music did not stop even after the bucket of cold water had been poured over the small girl. The violin strings and piano keys still floated across the wedding hall, but the notes had grown brittle, as if mocking the sight of a child drenched and trembling. Lila Harper knelt on the marble floor, her dark hair plastered to her cheeks, her little hands wrapped desperately around the frame of her father's photograph. Around her, the guests whispered, their voices laced with disdain or indifference. She looked so out of place in her faded dress, the fabric clinging wet to her bony shoulders. Her suitcase toppled beside her, spilling out one worn sweater and a pair of shoes too small for her growing feet. From the back of the hall, Officer Mark Dalton had already begun to move before he realized it. His boots echoed on the marble, each step carrying the weight of both anger and grief. The tall, broad-shouldered man cut an imposing figure, his dark patrol uniform fitting snugly against his frame. A heavy winter jacket draped across his shoulders. His storm-gray eyes, normally quiet and guarded, now blazed with fury. At his side moved Ranger, his 7-year-old German shepherd, fur shimmering black and silver under the golden light. The dog's ears were erect, his amber eyes trained on the crowd, his posture taut, as though ready to lunge at anyone who dared to harm the child again. Ranger was not just a service animal, he was Mark's partner in every sense, a creature shaped by discipline and loyalty, yet endowed with an instinct for protection that often surpassed human hesitation. Tonight, the dog sensed not just hostility, but something darker, the injustice of an innocent being mocked. The guests slowly realized what was happening. Glasses lowered mid-toast, laughter died in throats. A man near the buffet table muttered, "Isn't that Dalton, the cop?" Another whispered, "What's he doing here?" Mark ignored them. He had been hired unofficially to provide security at this event, a courtesy due to the wealthy bride's insistence on safeguarding her guest list. He had intended to remain unseen, a shadow at the edge of the festivities, but what he had witnessed pulled him into the center of the storm. Mark stopped before the child, his face shadowed under the chandelier's glare. Slowly he removed his thick winter coat, the one still lined with fleece against the Vermont chill, and draped it around Lila's tiny shoulders. The coat swallowed her, turning her into a bundle of fabric, but the warmth spread instantly through her shivering body. She looked up, eyes wide, disbelief etched across her delicate features. "You're safe now," Mark whispered low, though the hall was so silent that even those words seemed to echo. Ranger stepped forward too, planting himself firmly between Lila and the crowd. His fur bristled, a low growl rumbling in his throat, the kind of sound that sent a ripple of unease through the guests. Ranger's amber eyes swept over Martha Caldwell, the aunt who still held the empty bucket in her hand, her face frozen in half a sneer. Martha was a heavy woman, with powdered cheeks and lips painted too red, always hungry for drama. Yet now she shifted back half a step, unsettled by the growling dog. Harold Caldwell, her husband, scratched his gray beard nervously but tried to keep a mocking grin. At the center of the room, the bride herself, Vivian Harrington, stiffened. She was tall, slender, her auburn hair cascading in flawless waves over the lace bodice of her gown. Every inch of her was crafted for display. Her smile, her gestures, the tremble of her voice when she pretended to sympathize. She was 30, still young enough to feign fragility, but behind her pale green eyes burned a calculating mind. To the guests, she was a tragic figure, a widow who had carried the burden of raising her late husband's child. Yet, Vivian's true nature was nothing like her act. Ambition drove her every move, and Lila, the last tie to her dead husband's fortune, was nothing but a nuisance. Mark straightened, turning his gaze to the hall. His voice, low and rough from years of shouting commands across police radios, carried now with a different weight. "Doesn't anyone see anything wrong here?" The words sliced through the silence, and several guests flinched. Some shifted uncomfortably, others lowered their eyes to their glasses, but none dared speak. The illusion of merriment had cracked. It was then that Richard Bellamy, the groom, finally stepped into the scene. He was 32, tall and striking, with dark hair slicked back and a smile that had always won him favor. To the town, Richard was the charming bachelor who had swept the grieving widow off her feet. In reality, he was opportunistic, drawn more to Vivian's connections and inheritance than to her heart. He moved now with an ease that felt rehearsed, placing an arm gently around Vivian's shoulders as though to steady her. His voice was smooth, honeyed, designed to soothe. "Officer Dalton, perhaps you misunderstand. This is a family matter. Let's not disrupt a sacred celebration." Mark's jaw tightened, but he did not answer at once. Instead, he bent slightly, addressing Lila in a voice so gentle it contrasted the steel he showed the crowd. "What's your name, sweetheart?" The girl hesitated, her lips trembling. Lila Harper." She spoke the surname like a prayer, holding tight to her father's legacy. Mark nodded slowly. "Well, Lila, no one will hurt you while I'm here." Vivian's painted smile returned as she leaned forward. To the guests, she exuded poise, but her words hissed like venom. Mr. Dalton, thank you for your concern. But, you see, Lila can be dramatic. She's just emotional, struggling since her father's passing. We manage fine at home, don't we, dear? Her eyes bore into the girl, a silent threat behind the sweet tone. Lila's small body stiffened, tears pooling again. She whispered so low only Mark could hear, "Please don't let her send me back." Mark's heart clenched. He had heard that same plea once before, years ago, when Sarah, his daughter, had begged him not to leave her bedside during those final hospital hours. The memory struck like lightning. He looked away, blinking hard, then fixed his storm-gray eyes on Vivian. "I think the child's voice is the one that matters here." Ranger growled louder, his stance widening. The crowd pulled back instinctively, forming a circle around the unlikely trio. The policeman, the dog, and the drenched child. A woman in a blue satin gown muttered to her companion, "This is inappropriate." A man in a tuxedo whispered, "He's right, though. Did you see what they did to her?" The murmurs spread, unease stirring. Vivian's Aunt Martha, desperate to reclaim control, snapped, "That child is insolent. She embarrasses us all. Officer, don't meddle in what you don't understand." Her voice cracked slightly under the pressure. Harold added with a laugh that rang hollow, "Why not take her yourself, Dalton, if you care so much? She's nothing but a burden." For the first time since the silence fell, Lila raised her voice, thin and shaky but piercing. It cut through the murmurs. "I am not a burden." The words startled even her, but once spoken they could not be taken back. The guests stared, some with pity, some with shame. Mark's chest swelled with a grim resolve. He crouched slightly so he was eye level with Lila, placed a hand on her trembling shoulder, and said clearly, "You're not alone anymore." Ranger pressed closer, tail stiff, ears sharp, as though sealing the vow with his presence. The hall, drenched in golden light and hushed whispers, held its breath. Snow tapped softly against the windows, muffled by the heavy curtains. Yet inside all eyes fixed on this singular tableau. At that moment, the wedding was no longer about gowns, champagne, or wealth. It was about the fragile dignity of a small girl, the courage of a policeman, and the fierce loyalty of a dog. And the silence that followed was the beginning of everything yet to come. The snow outside had thickened into a curtain, drifting in heavy flakes that blurred the edges of the Vermont town. Inside the hall, silence had held for a long moment after Officer Mark Dalton's defiant question. But, like all silences in a crowd, it broke quickly, splintering into whispers and nervous laughter. Vivian Harrington, still radiant in her wedding gown, clutched her bouquet tighter, her smile trembling, though her green eyes flashed with fury. Her new husband, Richard Bellamy, stood by her side, the perfect picture of charm, whispering reassurances to the guests, his hand gently guiding his bride away from the confrontation. Yet, beneath his polished exterior, the stiffness in his jaw betrayed unease. Mark remained where he was, a solid wall of resolve. Lila Harper shivered under his coat, her small body half hidden in the folds of the heavy fabric, while Ranger, his German shepherd, pressed close against her, the dog's amber eyes sweeping the room like a sentry daring anyone to approach. Mark's expression had hardened into something implacable. It was not just a policeman's discipline, but the iron resolve of a father who had once failed to protect his own child and swore never to fail again. Vivian's Aunt Martha sputtered indignantly, her face flushed red beneath layers of powder. "This is an outrage!" she hissed, her voice cracking in a shrill note that drew attention she had not intended. Harold, her husband, tried to interject with a mocking laugh, but found the sound faltering in his throat when Ranger let out a low growl, the kind that resonated in the chest and made the air feel heavier. Guests shifted uncomfortably, some glancing toward the doors as if considering escape from the tension. And then, quietly but firmly, Mark spoke. "We're leaving." He reached down, taking Lila's icy hand in his broad one. She looked up at him, her eyes wet and uncertain, but clutched his hand tightly nonetheless, as if it were the only anchor in a sea of cruelty. Vivian's painted smile froze. "You can't take her," she said sweetly, though her tone carried venom underneath. "She's mine, she's family." Mark's eyes, storm-gray and piercing, met hers with cold disdain. "No, she's her father's daughter, and everyone here just saw what you call family." A murmur rippled through the crowd. Some nodded slightly, guilt seeping into their features. Others looked away, unwilling to confront what they had just witnessed. Richard stepped forward, his voice calm, but carrying a thread of irritation. "Mr. Dalton, please don't turn this into a spectacle. Think of the bride, think of our guests." Mark cut him off, his voice rough but steady. "I'm thinking of the child, and I won't stand by." With that, he tightened his grip on Lila's hand and began to move toward the great doors. Ranger trotted beside them, muscles tense, ears flicking at every movement. A few guests, startled, stepped aside. Others tried to block the way but faltered under Mark's unyielding gaze and Ranger's menacing presence. One man, a tall banker with a glass still in hand, started forward to protest, but stopped dead when Ranger bared his teeth in silence. Outside, the cold struck immediately. The night was thick with falling snow, the lamps casting halos of golden haze that blurred into the white. The sound of music and chatter dulled behind the heavy doors, replaced by the crunch of boots on snow and the sharp inhale of winter air. Lila stumbled slightly, her wet shoes slipping on the frozen steps, but Mark steadied her, scooping up the battered suitcase she carried. He could feel her trembling, not just from the cold, but from the fear that this fragile rescue might collapse at any moment. "Please," she whispered, her voice small against the storm. "I don't want to go back. Don't let them take me." Mark crouched briefly, his face close to hers, his voice softened from its usual sternness. "You won't go back, not while I'm here." Ranger leaned against Lila's side, as though to seal the promise with his presence. The German shepherd's fur was dusted white by the snow, his breath misting in the freezing air, but his posture remained strong, alert, unwavering. As they walked through the snow toward the patrol car Mark had parked on a side street, the town around them felt hushed, every sound muted by the storm. Houses stood dark, chimneys smoking faintly, windows shuttered against the cold. The old church bell tolled the hour in the distance, muffled by the thick air. For a moment, it felt as though the world itself had stopped to watch a man, a child, and a dog carve their way into an uncertain future. A figure emerged from the shadows near the corner of the hall, pulling her fur-lined shawl closer around her shoulders. She was Mrs. Eleanor Whitman, a longtime resident of the town and the owner of a local bookstore. Eleanor was in her 60s, slender and tall, with sharp features softened by lines of age and kindness. Her graying hair was tucked under a knitted cap, and her eyes, pale blue, had a way of seeing straight through facades. She had known Lila's father when he was alive, often exchanging books with him, and she had never trusted Vivian. She watched silently now, her lips pressing together in disapproval as she saw the soaked child and the officer guiding her away. She said nothing, but her presence was noted, and in time, her quiet testimony would matter. Mark opened the car door, helping Lila inside and settling Ranger into the back seat beside her. The child sat curled, clutching the photograph against her chest, while the dog leaned close, his warmth radiating against her side. Mark slid behind the wheel, his face grim, the headlights cutting through the falling snow as he steered away from the glittering hall. Behind them, the music swelled once more, the laughter and clinking, glasses resuming as though nothing had happened. Vivian, no doubt, was already spinning her tale to salvage the evening, but outside, in the storm, a small girl was carried away, not just from cruelty, but toward a fragile hope. And in that moment, as the patrol car disappeared into the snowy streets, the balance of fate had shifted. The road out of town stretched long and silent, bordered by rows of pine trees weighed down by snow. The patrol car's headlights carved tunnels of pale yellow through the darkness, the storm falling thicker now, swirling against the windshield in frantic patterns. Inside the car, the heater hummed but could not erase the chill of the night or the tension that hung in the silence. Lila Harper sat curled in the back seat, clutching her father's photograph close to her chest. The oversized police coat swallowed her frame, her damp hair sticking to her cheeks. Ranger, the German shepherd, pressed against her side, his amber eyes alert, his ears twitching at every sound. The steady warmth of his body and the faint rhythm of his breathing provided a comfort no human words could. Mark Dalton kept his eyes on the road, his strong hands gripping the wheel tighter than necessary. His storm gray eyes flicked occasionally to the rearview mirror, catching the small figure huddled there. He had seen children in distress before in his career, but something about this girl struck deeper, tugging at an old wound that had never healed. He remembered Sarah, his daughter, how she used to sing softly in the car during long drives, her voice bright even when storms raged outside. Losing her in that accident had hollowed him out, leaving him cautious about forming bonds, wary of letting his heart open again. But seeing Lila tonight, so fragile yet clinging to dignity, had awakened something in him. They reached his house on the edge of town, a modest wooden cabin built decades earlier, its roof now layered with snow. The house stood at the edge of a forest clearing, with a small shed and a fenced yard that Ranger used to patrol. Mark parked and helped Lila out, carrying her battered suitcase inside. The cabin smelled faintly of cedar and coffee, its living room simple: old leather sofa, a stone fireplace, bookshelves filled with worn novels and case reports. On the mantel, a photograph of Sarah still rested in its frame, the glass slightly cracked, the girl's smile frozen in time. Lila noticed it immediately. "She looks like me?" she whispered. Mark hesitated, his throat tightening, before nodding. "That's Sarah, my daughter. She passed away a long time ago." He didn't elaborate, but the sadness in his eyes told enough. Lila's small fingers clutched her own photo tighter, as if two ghosts had silently introduced themselves. Ranger circled the room, sniffing as if making sure the house was safe, then settled by the fireplace, his ears still pricked. Mark guided Lila to the kitchen table, heating soup on the stove. She sat silently, her eyes darting around, as though unsure if she was allowed to be there. Her small hands trembled as she spooned the soup, eating cautiously, as though afraid she might be punished for taking too much. Mark watched, his chest heavy, and quietly slid a slice of bread toward her. Later, he prepared a guest room. It was simple, with a bed covered in white sheets and a quilt folded neatly at the end. Lila placed her suitcase by the wall and set her father's photograph carefully on the nightstand, as though it were the most precious treasure she had. She whispered, "Thank you," barely audible. Mark only nodded, pulling the door to a gentle close. That night, as snow lashed against the windows, Mark sat in the living room, staring at the fire. Memories of Sarah filled the silence, her laughter echoing faintly in his mind. Ranger padded over, resting his head on Mark's knee, as if reminding him he was not alone. Mark's jaw tightened. Protecting this child was no longer a question of duty. It had become a vow. Elsewhere in town, the aftermath of the wedding brewed. Vivian Harrington sat before her vanity in the bridal suite, her gown discarded in a heap, her green eyes burning with fury. Richard Bellamy tried to calm her, sipping whiskey with studied ease, his handsome face carrying the smugness of a man who believed charm could fix anything. Vivian's Aunt Martha paced the room, fuming, while Harold sat heavily in a chair, muttering about humiliation. Vivian's voice was cold, almost mechanical. "He humiliated us, in front of everyone, a cop, of all people. He thinks he can take what belongs to me." At that moment, a new figure stepped into their circle. David Halpern, Vivian's attorney, had been summoned from a nearby town. David was in his early 40s, lean with slick black hair and thin glasses, his suit perfectly pressed despite the late hour. Known for his cunning and for twisting truth into performance, David carried a briefcase that seemed like an extension of his arm. His sharp brown eyes assessed the scene quickly. "If you want the girl back, we'll need to handle this legally, custody court. But you must play the grieving stepmother to perfection. Appear noble, appear wronged. Let the officer look like the overreaching villain." Vivian straightened, her fury cooling into calculation. This was her strength, not raw emotion, but manipulation. "Then, that is what I'll do." Back at Mark's cabin, the next morning dawned pale, the storm easing into a quiet snowfall. Lila woke to the sound of Ranger's claws clicking against the wooden floor. The dog pushed open her door with his nose, tail wagging lightly. Lila smiled faintly for the first time, reaching out to stroke his thick fur. "You're a good boy," she whispered, and Ranger leaned into her hand, his warmth grounding her. Mark prepared breakfast, eggs and toast, and though his cooking was simple, it filled the cabin with a homely scent. As they ate, there was a knock on the door. Mark's hand instinctively went to the sidearm at his belt before he opened it. Standing there was Clara Evans, a woman in her late 50s with silver-streaked hair pulled into a bun, her heavy coat dusted with snow. Clara had been the Harper family's housekeeper for nearly 20 years, dismissed by Vivian after Mr. Harper's death. She had a round face lined by years of hard work, eyes soft but carrying steel when needed. Clara had always cared for Lila like a grandmother. When she saw the child sitting at the table, Clara's eyes filled with tears. She rushed inside, kneeling to wrap Lila in her arms. "Oh, my poor girl," she murmured, her voice trembling. Lila clung to her, the first real embrace she had felt in months. Mark observed quietly, sensing the bond between them. Clara looked up at him, her expression wary but grateful. "Thank you for taking her. I feared no one would." Mark nodded. "She's safe here, but Vivian will come. She won't let go easily." Clara's face hardened. "Then you need to know the truth. Vivian doesn't care for her. She never did. And she's been meddling with the Harper estate, selling, transferring funds. I saw enough before she dismissed me to know she's hiding things." She pulled a small envelope from her coat pocket. Inside were copies of documents she had smuggled before leaving, receipts and letters hinting at embezzlement. Mark studied them, his jaw tightening. The battle ahead was no longer just about a child's safety. It was about exposing the corruption of a woman who had fooled an entire community. That night, Lila fell asleep, clutching both the photograph of her father and Ranger's collar, her breathing finally steady. Mark stood in the doorway, watching. He whispered to himself, a vow carried only by the crackle of the fire. "I won't lose her, not like I lost Sarah." And in the shadows of his grief, hope began to stir. The snow had melted slightly by the time the first custody hearing came. The town's courthouse, an old brick building with pillars chipped by decades of storms, stood at the center of Main Street. That morning, the air was sharp and clear, the kind that carried sound easily, so that every creak of boots on the courthouse steps seemed amplified. People had gathered outside, drawn more by curiosity than concern, for the Harrington-Bellamy wedding scandal had spread like fire. Some came in fur-lined coats, others in worn jackets, their breaths puffing white clouds as they whispered about the widow, the child, and the officer who had interfered. Inside, the courtroom smelled faintly of varnish and old paper. The wooden benches creaked as townsfolk settled in, eager to watch. At the front sat Judge William Rourke, a man in his late 50s with a stern face softened only by the droop of his tired eyes. His salt and pepper hair was neatly combed, his robe falling loosely over his heavy frame. Known in town as a fair but weary man, he had spent decades listening to lies dressed as truths. Still, he carried a deep belief in law, though it had often disappointed him. To the left sat Vivian Harrington, dressed in somber gray, her auburn hair pinned back simply, no trace of the glamorous bride. Beside her was Richard Bellamy, his hand occasionally brushing hers in staged affection. Behind them sat Martha and Harold Caldwell, whispering encouragement, their faces tight with indignation. At the table in front of them, David Halpern, Vivian's attorney, arranged his papers with sharp precision, his thin lips curved in a half-smile, the kind that suggested he had already won. On the opposite side sat Mark Dalton, tall in his uniform, though he wore a plain coat today, his storm-gray eyes scanning the room with guarded intensity. Beside him was Lila, dwarfed by the wooden chair, her small legs swinging above the floor. She wore a simple dress Clara had found for her, pale blue with a knitted sweater. Her hair had been brushed carefully that morning, but her eyes still carried shadows of exhaustion. Ranger sat obediently at Mark's feet, his black and silver fur gleaming under the dim lights, his amber eyes fixed on the proceedings. Some in the gallery shifted uneasily at the sight of the German shepherd, but others seemed reassured by his calm presence. When the session began, David Halpern rose smoothly, his voice resonant. "Your Honor, we come today not because of neglect, but because of interference. My client, Mrs. Vivian Harrington, a grieving widow who has borne the noble burden of raising her late husband's child, now faces an outrageous act, an officer of the law storming into her wedding and seizing the child without consent. She is here not to attack, but to restore the dignity of her family and the stability of her daughter's home." His words were accompanied by carefully timed pauses, his tone dripping sympathy. Murmurs of agreement rose from Vivian's supporters in the gallery. Vivian dabbed her eyes delicately with a handkerchief, glancing at the judge with a trembling lip. She looked the part of a wounded guardian, and the audience seemed to believe it. Mark clenched his jaw but remained silent until the judge nodded for his side. He stood, his voice gravelly but steady. "Your Honor, I did not storm anything. I witnessed a child, soaked with water, humiliated, crying on the floor of a public hall while adults laughed. No one stepped in. Not her stepmother, not her relatives, not a single guest. I acted as any decent man, father, or officer should." He gestured gently toward Lila. "This child begged me not to send her back. That is why I am here." Gasps and whispers rippled through the courtroom. Judge Rourke tapped his gavel lightly. "Order!" David rose again, his voice sharper now. "Words, nothing but words. Children can be dramatic. Grief makes them confused, even rebellious. We have witnesses, Your Honor. Guests who saw nothing but a minor tantrum." He gestured toward Martha Caldwell, who eagerly rose, her heavy frame trembling with righteous anger. "That child," she declared, pointing a finger at Lila, "is ungrateful. We clothed her, fed her, gave her a home. And how does she repay us? By embarrassing her stepmother on the most important day of her life." Harold chimed in from his seat. "She's a liar, always has been." Mark wanted to retort, but Judge Rourke signaled for silence. Then he turned gently toward Lila. "Young lady, would you like to say something?" Lila's small hands twisted in her lap. Her voice, when it came, was thin but clear. "They locked me in rooms. They called me names. I never wanted to ruin her wedding. I just wanted to remember my dad. Please, don't make me go back." Her eyes glistened, her face pale. A hush fell, but it didn't last. David moved swiftly. "Your Honor, children say many things when frightened or influenced. Officer Dalton, perhaps with the best of intentions, has filled her with these ideas. But sentiment does not make truth." The judge rubbed his forehead, sighing. He had seen too many of these cases, too many blurred lines between truth and performance. "We'll need evidence," he said. "Claims are not enough." As the proceedings continued, Ranger shifted suddenly, his ears pricking, a low growl rising in his throat. His amber eyes locked on a man seated behind Vivian. The man was tall, gaunt, with a scar running down his cheek, his dark coat buttoned up to his throat. He had remained silent until now, but Ranger's growl drew every eye toward him. The man glanced briefly at the dog, then back at Vivian, his jaw tightening. And for a moment, something unspoken passed between them. Mark noted it, his instincts flaring. Judge Rourke frowned. "Control your animal, officer." Mark gave a sharp command, and Ranger quieted, though his gaze did not leave the man. The trial adjourned temporarily, the judge requesting both sides gather more substantial testimony. Vivian left with Richard's arm around her, whispering in David's ear with a smile that had nothing to do with sorrow. Mark guided Lila out, Ranger close by, his eyes still scanning for threats. The battle was only beginning, and though Mark had spoken truth, it seemed the court was still leaning toward Vivian's carefully woven lies. The wind rattled against the high windows of the Harrington mansion that night, snowflakes skittering like shards of glass across the panes. The storm had returned, sweeping through the quiet town with a raw edge, covering streets and rooftops in white silence. Inside the mansion, however, silence was of another kind, a silence sharp with cruelty. Lila was dragged through the grand hallway by Vivian, her thin arm held in an iron grip. Vivian's face, once painted with a courtroom mask of grief and dignity, now twisted with fury. Her auburn hair, freed from its neat pins, whipped around her pale cheeks as she hissed under her breath. Vivian was 30, tall and striking, with sharp cheekbones that lent her an almost regal appearance. But her beauty was hollow, her gray eyes cold and restless, sharpened by a life of scheming. She had grown up the eldest daughter of a failed banker, Martha's brother, who had lost everything in a scandal. Vivian had sworn never to be powerless again, never to know the taste of poverty, and so she had perfected the art of deception, soft smiles in public, venom in private. She shoved Lila into a narrow hallway at the far end of the house and opened a small iron door. Inside lay a dark room with mold-streaked walls and a bare metal bed. The smell of dampness and dust hit Lila's nose, making her shiver. Vivian's voice cut like a blade. "Stay here until you learn to keep your mouth shut. You made a fool of me today. Don't think anyone will save you." She slammed the door and turned the key with finality. Lila stumbled to the floor, clutching her photo frame tightly. Her father's face smiled faintly from behind the cracked glass. Tears streamed down her cheeks as she pressed the frame to her chest. "Daddy," she whispered, "how long must I stay strong?" The only reply was the howl of the wind through the cracks in the window. Hours passed. The dark pressed close, broken only by a thin sliver of light sneaking beneath the door. Lila huddled in the corner, pulling the thin blanket from the bed around her shoulders. As her fingers traced the wooden frame of her father's photograph, she felt something unusual, a tiny bump on the back edge. Her heart quickened. She pried gently with her fingernails. The wood splintered slightly and a folded slip of paper slid free. Her breath caught. With trembling hands, she unfolded the paper. The handwriting was uneven but familiar. Her father's. The words blurred through her tears. "If anything should happen to me, my daughter Lila must never be placed in the care of Vivian Harrington. She is not to be trusted. I trust that those who find this will protect my child." The letter burned in her hands, both hope and fear flooding her chest. Her father had known. He had tried to protect her even from beyond the grave. She pressed the paper against her lips, whispering through sobs, "You knew. You left me something," while Lila clung. To this secret, elsewhere in town, Mark Dalton sat in his modest home, staring at the flames in the fireplace. Ranger lay at his feet, his black and silver fur rising and falling with each slow breath, but his amber eyes remained half open, ever watchful. Mark's mind replayed the trial again and again, the lies, the laughter, the doubt in the judge's weary eyes. His fists clenched against his knees. He had once sworn to uphold justice, but tonight the law felt like a wall built against him. Ranger stirred and rested his muzzle against Mark's boot, as though sensing the storm inside his master. Mark reached down, scratching behind his ears. "We can't fail her, boy. Not again." Meanwhile, at the Harrington estate, another figure moved quietly in the night. Clara Watkins, once the housekeeper of Lila's family, had been dismissed after the father's death under the pretense of cutting expenses. In truth, Vivian had despised her loyalty to the child. Clara was in her early 60s. Her frame stooped slightly with age, her silver hair pulled into a loose bun. Lines etched her face, but her blue eyes carried both gentleness and determination. She had worked most of her life in service, and though her body often ached, her heart remained tender, especially toward the little girl she had once tucked into bed with lullabies. That night, Clara slipped through the servants' entrance she had used for years, her steps muffled on the stone floor. She had heard whispers in town, whispers of Lila's humiliation, of the trial. Her conscience had burned too long in silence, and now she could no longer stay away. Guided by memory, she climbed the back stairs toward the narrow hall. She paused outside the iron door, pressing her ear against it. Inside, she heard faint sobs, the broken sound of a child crying herself into exhaustion. Clara's chest tightened. She pulled a small hairpin from her shawl and bent down. Her hands shook slightly, but years of cleaning and mending had made them steady in moments of need. After several tense seconds, the lock clicked. The door creaked open, light spilling into the room. Lila's head snapped up, her eyes wide with terror at first, until she saw the familiar face. "Clara!" she gasped, her voice hoarse. "Yes, child," Clara whispered, rushing to kneel beside her. She gathered the trembling girl into her arms, rocking her gently. "Hush now. We must be quick. I couldn't stay silent any longer." Lila clutched the paper and frame tightly against her chest. "Clara, I found a letter from Daddy. It says I can't be with Vivian. He wrote it for me." She pulled the crumpled paper from the frame and thrust it into Clara's hands. Clara's eyes widened as she read, her lips tightening. "Then this," she murmured, "is what will save you." But heavy footsteps echoed down the corridor. Clara's face paled. She tucked the letter back into Lila's hands and pressed a finger to her lips. Quiet. Follow me. She led Lila out into the hall, their shadows stretching along the flickering candlelight. Down the back stairs they crept, Lila clutching the frame, Clara guiding her like she had in years past during storms. They slipped through the servants' entrance and into the night. Snow whipped around them, stinging their faces, but Clara's grip was firm. Hold on, child. We're going to Officer Dalton. He will know what to do. Lila's small voice trembled, carried by the storm. Will he keep me safe? Clara pulled her shawl tighter around the girl, her eyes shining with determination. Yes, my dear. He won't let them hurt you again. The wind swallowed their figures as they hurried toward the distant lights of town, the letter hidden against Lila's chest, her father's last act of protection guiding her steps. The storm had grown heavier by the time Clara and Lila reached the outskirts of town. Snow fell in thick curtains, muffling their footsteps as they trudged through drifts that reached up to Clara's knees. The old woman's breath came hard, mist rising in sharp bursts into the night air, but she pressed forward with a tenacity born of both fear and love. Lila stumbled alongside her, clutching the photo frame tightly under her coat, the hidden letter pressed against her chest. Every gust of wind made her shiver, but she refused to let go. For the first time in months, she carried something that felt like hope. Mark Dalton's home stood at the edge of town, a weathered cabin of timber and stone. Its chimney sent up a faint thread of smoke, the only sign of warmth in the frozen night. Inside, Mark had been pacing before the fire. The courtroom defeat weighed on him like an iron shackle. He had failed once before to save his daughter Sarah, and now the thought of failing Lila gnawed at his soul. Ranger, his German shepherd, paced restlessly too, ears pricked as if he sensed something beyond the storm. At 7 years old, Ranger was in his prime, a muscular creature with a thick black and silver coat and intelligent amber eyes. He was steady by nature, protective to the bone, and had been Mark's closest companion since his wife's passing years earlier. Tonight, Ranger growled low, padding to the door. Moments later came the knock, urgent, uneven. Mark opened the door into the howling snow and saw Clara, her silver hair plastered to her cheeks, her body hunched against the cold. Beside her stood Lila, trembling in her torn coat, wide eyes searching his face. For a breath, Mark thought he was seeing Sarah again, fragile, desperate, clinging to something unseen. He bent quickly, scooping Lila into his arms, feeling her small frame shaking against his chest. Ranger pressed close, sniffing her coat, then gave a sharp bark that seemed to echo his master's relief. Clara stepped inside, closing the door behind her, her breath shallow. I couldn't leave her there, she said, her voice raspy with exhaustion. Vivian has gone too far. She locked her in a dark room like a prisoner, and Lila found something her father left behind. Mark lowered Lila onto the sofa near the fire, the child's fingers uncurled, revealing the folded paper, the ink blurred with age. Mark read slowly, his jaw tightening with each line. The letter was brief but devastating, a direct warning from Lila's father, declaring Vivian unfit and untrustworthy. It was more than words. It was the voice of a man reaching across death to protect his daughter. Mark's hand trembled as he folded it again, his eyes blazing. This changes everything, he muttered. Clara sank into a chair, her shoulders sagging. She looked smaller than he remembered from years past, the long hours of housework and the grief of her dismissal having carved her into someone weary but still unbroken. Her blue eyes were clear, though, sharp with conviction. But evidence means little if no one is willing to speak. Vivian has friends in high places, and her lies are polished until they shine. She will fight like a cornered wolf. Mark nodded grimly. He turned to Lila, who had curled beneath Ranger's protective stance, her head resting against the dog's thick fur. The shepherd licked her damp hair once, a gesture of quiet reassurance. You're safe here, Mark said, kneeling so his eyes met hers. But we need to be brave. Your father's letter can't be hidden again. It must be heard. Lila nodded faintly, her voice no more than a whisper. Will the judge listen this time? Before Mark could answer, Clara leaned forward. We will need more than the letter. I kept quiet before because I feared losing my job. But I saw Vivian take money from the safe after the funeral. I saw her falsified documents. If I must swear it before the court, I will." Mark studied the woman, gratitude and sorrow warring in his chest. He had often blamed himself for being alone in his fight, but here was proof that truth still had allies. He reached across, placing his rough hand over Clara's frail one. "Then, you won't be standing alone this time." The following morning dawned pale, the storm having left the town buried in fresh snow. Word spread quickly of Vivian's show of control, of Clara's sudden return, of whispers that not everything in the Harrington household was as polished as it seemed. Mark knew the town was split, some still enchanted by Vivian's facade, others beginning to suspect cracks beneath the surface. At the diner that morning, whispers buzzed over steaming mugs of coffee. George Miller, a tall man in his 50s with salt and pepper hair and a stern but fair face, sat quietly listening. He had been a close friend of Lila's late father and had kept to himself since the funeral. George had been a carpenter all his life, strong hands calloused from decades of work. His broad frame still powerful, though age had slowed him. His loyalty to his late friend weighed heavily, and when he heard Clara's account, he knew it was time to step out of the shadows. He resolved to join Mark in court, bringing with him old records and testimonies the father had once entrusted him. Back at the cabin, Lila sat at the kitchen table, Ranger at her side, watching Mark make breakfast. It was nothing fancy, scrambled eggs and toast, but the simplicity of the act made her eyes widen. She had forgotten what it was like for someone to care in such small, ordinary ways. Clara bustled about too, despite Mark's protests that she should rest, tidying dishes as though she had always belonged. As they ate, Lila suddenly asked, "Mr. Dalton, why did you help me? At the wedding, you didn't even know me." Her eyes searched his face, large and unguarded. Mark paused, the fork heavy in his hand. The memory of Sarah returned like a wound reopening. His daughter had been almost the same age, her laughter filling the halls until the accident that took her away. He swallowed hard. "Because no one else did," he said softly. "And because I know what it's like to lose everything." He forced a small smile. "But now, maybe, we can both find something again." Ranger nudged Lila's elbow, making her giggle for the first time since arriving. The sound startled Mark. It was fragile but real, like sunlight breaking through storm clouds. He realized then that this fight was no longer just about the law. It was about restoring childhood itself to a girl robbed of it. That evening, as the sky dimmed to violet and the town settled into uneasy quiet, Mark sat with Clara and George in his living room. The fire burned bright, its light flickering across determined faces. The letter lay on the table, weighted by a coffee mug, while George's documents were spread beside it. Clara's testimony would stand as proof, George's records as corroboration, and Lila's voice, though fragile, would speak with the weight of innocence. Mark leaned back, exhaustion etched into his features, but resolve burning in his storm-gray eyes. "We'll face them again, and this time we'll have the truth on our side." Ranger, lying close to Lila's feet, thumped his tail once against the floor, as though sealing the promise. The battle ahead would be fierce, but for the first time in weeks, hope stirred within the cabin walls. The morning of the second hearing arrived with a heavy stillness that seemed to hang over the town. The courthouse stood solemn against a sky brushed with gray, the old stone walls dusted with frost. Inside, benches creaked as townspeople filed in, drawn by curiosity and whispers that this trial would reveal more than custody. It might uncover truths long buried. Reporters, bundled in coats, adjusted their cameras and shuffled their notebooks, eager to seize on scandal. The atmosphere was taut, like a bowstring pulled to its limit. Mark Dalton entered quietly, his frame tall but lean, clad in a modest dark suit that bore no sign of wealth but every sign of dignity. His storm-gray eyes, shadowed with fatigue, carried a fire that refused to be extinguished. Beside him walked Lila Harper, wearing a plain wool dress and her hair tied back with a ribbon Clara had found in a drawer. She clutched her father's photo frame in one hand, and in the other she held firmly onto Mark's palm. Ranger padded at their side, his black and silver coat brushed until it gleamed, his gait steady and solemn. The judge had allowed the dog inside after Mark argued that Ranger was not just a pet, but part of Lila's safety. Ranger's amber eyes scanned the room as if he understood the gravity of the moment. Across the aisle sat Vivian Harrington, transformed again into her role of grieving widow. She wore a simple black dress, her auburn hair pinned in a neat bun, her expression measured to show sorrow without bitterness. At her side was her husband Richard, handsome in his tailored suit, his arm draped protectively across her shoulders. And flanking them was David Carter, her attorney, a man of about 40 with silver-rimmed glasses and a reputation for precision and coldness in the courtroom. His lips curled faintly as though already confident of victory. The gavel struck, and Judge Whitmore, a heavy-set man with thinning gray hair and a reputation for stern impartiality, began the proceedings. His deep-set eyes scanned the room with weariness, but also with an unspoken warning that he would tolerate no theatrics. "We are here," he intoned, "to determine the best interest of the child, Lila Harper." David Carter rose first, his voice smooth, practiced. He painted Vivian as a victim of slander, a woman carrying the unbearable weight of her late husband's estate, while also caring for his daughter. His words spun a picture of noble sacrifice, of stability, of a home only disrupted by Officer Dalton's sudden interference. As he spoke, Vivian dabbed at her eyes with a handkerchief, her tears glistening under the courthouse lights. Several townspeople nodded, sympathy rising in their faces. But then it was Mark's turn. He stood, his voice steady, but edged with the weight of his loss. "I do not stand here to play the hero," he said, each word deliberate. "I stand here because a child was left humiliated, locked away, and treated as less than human. I cannot undo the lies spoken before, but today we bring more than words. We bring proof." He motioned toward Clara. Clara Watkins walked slowly to the stand. Though age had bent her back slightly, her presence filled the room with quiet gravity. Her silver hair framed a face lined with years of labor, but brightened by eyes sharp with conviction. She testified clearly, recounting how she had seen Vivian take money from the safe after the funeral, how she had been dismissed after questioning too much. Her voice never wavered, even when David Carter tried to dismiss her as a disgruntled servant. Clara's reply was firm. "I served that family for over 10 years. I know what I saw, and I know who truly cared for the child." A ripple moved through the room. Some of those who had once pitied Vivian now exchanged uncertain glances. Judge Whitmore's brow furrowed. Next came George Miller, tall and broad-shouldered, his carpenter's hands rough as he carried a file of documents to the stand. He had been a lifelong friend of Lila's father. His voice was deep, steady as oak, when he presented old records of asset transfers her father had begun, records that contradicted Vivian's claims of ownership. He spoke of promises made, of a man who had confided fears about his wife's ambitions. He trusted that someone would protect Lila if he could not, George finished, his eyes glistening as he looked at the girl. Vivian shifted uncomfortably, her composure cracking for the first time. Her gray eyes flicked toward Richard, who sat stiffly, his confident smile faltering. Finally, Mark placed the folded letter on the judge's bench. Judge Whitmore read it in silence. The room hushed, even the reporters leaning forward as though breath itself had stilled. The letter's words were simple, but they carried the undeniable weight of a dying man's plea. "Never entrust my daughter to Vivian." Vivian sprang up, her voice sharp, her mask shattering. "That paper means nothing. He was sick, delirious." Her outburst echoed too loud, too raw. Murmurs surged across the benches. For the first time, townspeople looked at her, not with sympathy, but with suspicion. Richard reached for her arm, but even his face betrayed unease. His polished charm faltered as whispers spread about embezzlement, about secrets hidden in plain sight. The judge raised his hand. Silence. His voice thundered through the chamber. He turned his gaze on Vivian, his eyes heavy with disappointment. "You have presented yourself as a grieving mother, but the evidence suggests otherwise. This court cannot ignore the testimony, the documents, or this letter." He paused, his gavel raised. "Guardianship of Lila Harper is hereby granted to Officer Mark Dalton. All financial matters concerning the estate will be reviewed under court supervision. Mrs. Harrington and Mr. Harrington, you are under investigation for fraud and possible neglect." The gavel came down with a resounding crack. For a heartbeat, silence reigned. Then Lila burst into tears and flung herself into Mark's arms, her small hands gripping his suit as though afraid he might vanish. Mark bent, holding her tightly, his own eyes glistening. Ranger pressed against them, tail thumping once in solemn approval. Vivian's face contorted with rage. She hissed threats under her breath as officers approached to escort her and Richard out. The facade had crumbled, and in its place remained only bitterness and shame. Townsfolk whispered, their voices tinged now with disdain instead of admiration. In that moment, for Lila, the courthouse no longer felt like a place of judgment, but of freedom. She had been heard, she had been believed, and in the arms of the man who had chosen to stand when all others had turned away, she felt the fragile beginnings of home. As they left the courthouse, snowflakes drifted gently, no longer the biting storm of nights past, but soft and light, like blessings from the sky. Mark tightened his hold on Lila's hand, Ranger walking faithfully at their side, Clara and George following close behind. For the first time in a long while, hope seemed stronger than the fear. Spring crept slowly into the Vermont Valley, melting the scars of winter one day at a time. Snowbanks shrank into rivulets that trickled through the streets, and the air carried the scent of thawing earth. The town, so recently caught in whispers of scandal and trial, now shifted its gaze toward renewal. Beneath budding maples and fresh grass, the shadows of the Harringtons faded into memory, while in one small cabin at the edge of town, life began again. Mark Dalton adjusted the porch steps of the cabin, his carpenter's hands steady even if unused to such delicate tasks. At 42, with broad shoulders and a face carved by years of duty and grief, he was a man remade by recent weeks. His storm-gray eyes, once dulled by sorrow, now carried light again. He had taken leave from the department for a time, recognizing that Lila needed him more than the badge did. His uniform now hung in the closet, replaced by flannel shirts and work boots, symbols of a man learning to build rather than simply enforce. Inside the cabin, Lila Harper busied herself at the kitchen table. She was still thin from months of neglect, her dark hair often falling into her eyes, but her cheeks carried new color, and her laughter surfaced more often. Clara had sewn her a few simple dresses, and she wore one today, pale blue with a small ribbon at the waist. Her small hands clutched colored pencils Nancy Parker had given her after the trial, and she bent over a notebook, drawing scenes that had lived in her memory. The courthouse, Ranger standing guard, Mark's steady hand lifting her from the marble floor of the wedding hall. Each drawing carried both pain and triumph, a record of survival told in a child's lines. Ranger dozed on the rug nearby, the black and silver German shepherd stretched out, his muzzle flecked with gray hairs that spoke of years lived with loyalty. At 7 years old, he was both protector and playmate. He had grown more watchful since Lila's arrival, often sleeping by her door at night or trotting at her side through the fields. His amber eyes softened when she laughed, as if he understood that her joy was as much his duty to guard as her safety. The household bustled more than it had in years. Clara Watkins, the 60-year-old housekeeper, had settled into the cabin as though she had never left service. She was not simply a caretaker now, but part of the family's fragile weave. Her silver hair was always tied back neatly, her frame bent but active, her hands steady as she kneaded dough or folded laundry. She had once lived a life of quiet servitude, shaped by years of being dismissed or overlooked. But now she carried herself with pride, knowing her voice had helped save a child. She hummed as she worked, an old lullaby that made Lila pause sometimes with tears in her eyes, remembering nights long ago when Clara had sung her to sleep in a different house. That morning, George Miller visited. The tall carpenter, with salt and pepper hair and hands hardened by decades of work, carried a wooden box he had crafted himself. Inside lay small trinkets of Lila's father, a pocket watch, a fountain pen, and a pair of cufflinks George had kept safe. "Your father trusted me with these," George said, his deep voice kind. "And now I trust you to keep them." Lila ran her fingers over the watch, her eyes wide. For the first time, she spoke without fear of being silenced. "I'll take care of them. I promise." George smiled, his lined face easing. That's all he ever wanted, to know his little girl would be safe. Mark stood nearby, watching the exchange with quiet emotion. It was not only custody that had been won, but a community of memory and loyalty rebuilt. Clara, George, Nancy. They had become the circle Lila needed, each giving what they could. Nancy Parker herself visited later that week, her gray suit exchanged for a casual coat. Her stern demeanor softened. She brought Lila a brand new set of books and told her firmly, "Education is freedom, child. Don't ever let anyone take that from you." Her words carried the authority of someone who had fought her way through a world where women's voices were often dismissed. Nancy had never married, her life shaped by years of dedication to law. And though she rarely showed tenderness, with Lila, her eyes glimmered. As the days grew warmer, Lila explored the cabin's land. The meadow behind the house unfurled into green, and she would run there with Ranger, her laughter chasing the wind. Sometimes she picked wildflowers and set them in jars on the kitchen table, insisting they made the room brighter. Mark, unused to such brightness, found himself smiling at the sight. One afternoon, under a sky washed blue and scattered with soft clouds, Mark carried out a long-forgotten kite. Its fabric was patched, its frame crooked, but the string was intact. He had built it for Sarah years before, though she had flown it only once before the accident. For years he had kept it tucked away, too painful to touch. But now he held it in his hands again, uncertain but resolute. "Want to try?" he asked softly, holding it out to Lila. Her eyes lit up, wide and bright. "Really? I've never flown one before." Together they stepped into the meadow. The wind picked up, tugging at the string as Mark guided her small hands. Ranger bounded beside them, barking as if urging the kite higher. With a sudden gust, the kite lifted, climbing into the sky. Lila squealed, her laughter ringing out across the fields. She clutched Mark's hand on the string, her grip firm, her eyes shining with awe. Mark's heart swelled, the ache of memory softened by the sound of joy. For the first time, he allowed himself to laugh with her, his deep voice mixing with her high one, filling the air with something he thought he had lost forever. Clara watched from the porch, tears glistening in her eyes, while George, who had come by with tools to help mend a fence, paused and let out a small chuckle. Even Nancy, arriving just then, with another notebook for Lila, stood quietly at the edge of the meadow, her lips curving into a smile. As the kite soared higher, Lila whispered, "Daddy, do you see this?" She meant her father, of course, but the word dad slipped so naturally now when she looked at Mark that he nearly dropped the string. He turned to her, his eyes wet, and whispered back, "Yes, sweetheart, I see it." The kite tugged against the sky, dancing like a banner of freedom, its tail fluttering in the sunlight. The meadow echoed with their laughter, Ranger leaping joyfully, the German shepherd's form a streak of black and silver against green. For that moment, there was no courtroom, no pain, no shadows, only a family reborn. Later that evening, the cabin glowed with lamplight. Lila set her father's photo beside a framed picture of Sarah that Mark had finally placed on the mantel. 2 frames, 2 lives once torn apart, now standing side by side. Mark rested his hand gently on Lila's shoulder. "Now we are a family," he said softly, the words carrying both promise and release. Lila turned, her lips trembling as she asked, "Can I call you Dad now?" Mark's throat tightened. He bent, pulling her close, his arms strong around her fragile frame. "Yes," he whispered into her hair. "From now on, you can always call me Dad." In that cabin, once cold with silence, voices now rose. Laughter, conversation, the simple noises of life returning. Outside, spring winds rustled the budding trees, carrying the promise of seasons yet to come. In the end, this story reminds us that God's hand is often at work in the quietest of ways. A broken home, a frightened child, and a man weighed down by his past were all woven together into something new, a family born from grace. Just as Mark and little Lila found hope through courage and faith, we too can see God's miracles in our everyday lives, if only we open our eyes and hearts. Perhaps it is in a kind word, a loyal friend, or even the love of a faithful dog that His presence is revealed. If you believe in God's protection, share this story with someone who needs encouragement today. Leave a comment with where you are watching from. And if you feel His miracle in this story, write Amen in the comments. Do not forget to subscribe so that more people can hear stories of hope. May the Lord bless you and keep you always.